Terima kasih, Pak Les. That's the sort of introduction that my father would have loved to have heard and my mother would have believed. So it truly is a great honour for me to be here tonight, and particularly in a place which honours not one of the giants of Southeast Asian study in Australia, but I think the giant in Professor John Leake. So for me to come here and speak at an institute which honours John Leake through the name of its library is a truly great personal honour for me. Before going up to Indonesia, I spent some considerable time with John, as Rowan knows, through Kate Leake, his daughter who writes for The Australian. I was able to spend quite some time with Professor Leake, and his active interest, his engagement, the lucid way in which he still thinks about Indonesia was a true inspiration to me. So it's great to be here tonight. The Chinese have a lovely saying, as they do, a four-character phrase, "Zai ban menungfu," which means to fiddle around with an axe at the door of the master carpenter, Lao Ban, which kind of means to show off one's very limited knowledge in front of some true experts. And as I look around the room, I do feel like I'm fiddling around with an axe at the door of the master carpenter here, Lao Ban. So I look forward to having a conversation with you tonight, because I think that will be a great way that we can sort of learn from each other. But I do have, I think, some unique experience to pass on from my experiences with the Indonesian military, and particularly that first year, 2009, that I spent inside their College of National Governance. It taught me a lot about the way that Indonesians think, and I think it made me a better attaché for Australia to Indonesia because of that experience. But first of all, let me start off with some truth in advertising here. I am not a Melburnian. I hate driving in Melbourne. I don't like the hook turn things and the tram tracks. So my key card is my passport around Melbourne.
Most of us have a similar passport.
Yeah. If you want a glimpse into what Australia will look like in 2030, I'd invite you to come with me and my key card on the Belgrave line. I live out near beyond Ringwood. To come in from Ringwood and pass through places like Mitcham and Nunawading and the People's Republic of Box Hill, it's an amazing experience. You will hear rich cultures, a variety of languages. You can hear Cambodian, even Lao, Vietnamese certainly, and of course the Chinese. And the Chinese is very interesting that you hear on the train. As a Mandarin linguist, I like to sit and listen.
They won't know that you're on.
No, well, that's right. That's what it is kind of fun for me, just to sit there with my ears open. But what strikes me is that when I was growing up, I heard a lot of Chinese, the Hokkien of the Malaysian Chinese. I heard the Cantonese of the Hong Kong Chinese, but I didn't hear much Mandarin. The Mandarin that I hear on the Belgrave line coming into Melbourne most days is standard Northern Chinese Mandarin. And I think that the Ken Henry white paper, which I think was a brilliant, one of the most important white papers that this country's ever produced, I think the Ken Henry white paper would have been better called not Australia in the Asian Century, but the Asian Century in Australia, because that's what's happening. We are being dragged culturally and economically to the north, and the north is being dragged toward us. And this is an exciting time to be an Asianist, as I know Rowan would agree. Unfortunately, not even continental drift will save us. I speak to friends in Geoscience Australia who tell me that the tectonic shelf that Indonesia sits on is coming over the top of our tectonic shelf at the rate of about 6 centimetres a year. So I used to always joke with my Indonesian military colleagues that they were invading Australia at 6 centimetres a year. So, I think one of the results of such a large Chinese influence in our society is, I think, our appreciation of Indonesia as a people, as a society, largely is underdone. And that's a pity, because although China will always be the big player in the Asian century for various reasons, I think that for Australia there may be an even more redolent connection with our large neighbour off our northwest shelf, And I don't think that's fully appreciated yet around Australia. I speak to people like Greg Feely at the ANU. Greg remonstrated with me about 2 years ago. Gary, I can't even give away scholarships to kids to come and study at the ANU on Indonesian studies. And the amount of Bahasa taught in our schools these days is actually less than when I went through school in the 1970s. And that's something which I think we can work better at, we can do better at. But like you, and I guess the reason that we're all out here on a very chilly Melbourne evening is because I believe that we have a sense that 250 million people off our northwest shelf can't be ignored. And geography matters. Geography really does matter. I guess my main theme tonight is that I don't think we in the military, but we Australians don't fully appreciate the powerful networks that we can gain access to around the Asian region by our military diplomacy. Military diplomacy is something which is not fully sort of appreciated across the board, let alone at official levels. And I think the evidence for that, for me, was in the 270 pages of that brilliant Ken Henry tome on the Asian century. There was not one reference to defence attaché, not one reference to military diplomacy. And that kind of deals us out of some really important networks around the region. We, like everyone, I guess, we see the region through our own lens. And sometimes we expect that defence forces are just like our defence force. And our defence force is the product of a Westminster system, a post-Cromwell era where civil control exercises tight rein on the dogs of war as it should. But that's not the case in almost all of the rest of our region. We are the odd man in the Asia-Pacific region, I believe, from that aspect. The only two countries that I can think of that actually act rather like, well, the Defence Forces act rather like our Defence Force acts are New Zealand and possibly Malaysia. But if you look across the sweep of our region, the Vietnam People's Army, probably the largest indentured labour force in that country, the Royal Thai Army, which is an absolute economic powerhouse for Thailand, countries like the Philippines, the kingmakers in the Philippines Army, and you hear every now and again of a coup in the Philippines. I don't think we fully appreciate the social, political and cultural roles that the military play around our region, and none more so than the Tentara Nasional Indonesia, the TNI, is the Indonesian Armed Forces. I would like to maybe raise two instances of where I think our military diplomacy has been a key enabler for us as a country in Indonesia. And the first was the announcement in, I think it was about late 2011, an announcement by Prime Minister Hurley and Barack Obama about the stationing of Marines in Darwin. This caused an initial knee-jerk reaction among the Kemlu, the foreign affairs community up in Indonesia. And it wasn't until we took a group of public spokesmen for the Indonesian military down to Darwin, showed them around, showed them the fact there was no Marine Corps base in Darwin, that the press in Indonesia started to shift back toward, well, this isn't such a bad thing. Having the Marine Corps in Darwin is something which we could possibly benefit from. And that was really the line that was the party line from the Defence Department, quite in stark contrast to Pak Marty Natalegawa's department, the Foreign Ministry in Indonesia. And that sort of military diplomacy, I think, achieved Australia's objective of explaining and clarifying the role of the Marines in Darwin in a way that we would not have been able to did we not have such a good link into the TNI in Indonesia. Secondly, many years ago I had the great joy and pleasure of working for the late John Baker, the Australian Defence Force Chief. When John Baker left his job as the Chief of the Australian Defence Force, he went to Yass and he raised sheep on a farm in Yass. Indonesian generals, when they retire, don't go off to a farm. They continue to plot and to kingmake, and they continue to do things like become the president of the country. If I don't miss my guess, at the next Democrat Party rally, I think we'll probably have another general, the President's brother-in-law, the First Lady's brother, will probably, in my view, be announced as the Party Democrats' candidate for President after SBY. As you know, General Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono has to retire or step down after his second term next year. You'll also have General Prabowo Subianto. I think the only person that I think has a good chance of knocking him off is the current civilian governor of Jakarta. Probably General Wiranto will play a part again, as he did in the last round of elections. So Indonesian generals continue a very high-profile role in the country in a way that is uncommon in this country. And I don't think that military diplomacy to that extent is fully appreciated here either. I guess my plan tonight is to talk in very broad terms about the Australia-Indonesia relationship. I know you've had far more qualified speakers than I, Bill Farmer and others who have talked here this year about Indonesia. But I would like to give you a perspective on the Indonesia that I encountered in my 4 years, the last 4 years in Jakarta. I'd then like to focus on the defence aspects, and I'd like to do that in the sense of the past 70 years of our defence relationship, the present day, and what I think the future could hold for us in the defence realm between our two countries. But first of all, I guess for those in the audience who aren't familiar with the role of a defence attaché, and Neil can certainly help me out here, a defence attaché is a really interesting position in an embassy. It's almost like being the relationship manager for Australia with the military of that country. And now you can have some incredible experiences, and I know that Neil Thompson, Colonel Thompson, was our first boots on the ground in Bali after the first bombing there in 2002. You can have that sort of response, person on the ground, on the situation, first of the situation, to take charge type experience. Other colleagues of mine have been in the embassy when it was bombed in 2004. Others were there for the Padang earthquake in 2009. Luckily, I was relatively free of that kind of drama, high drama during my time. But you could also, I think, the main role is to simply be the messenger, if you like, from Canberra to the military in Jakarta, and vice versa, to try and explain the way Indonesia is thinking, while not advocating, but explaining the way that Indonesia is thinking to Canberra, to your seniors in Canberra, and vice versa, to advocate the Australian position up in Jakarta to the very powerful Indonesian armed forces. So to that extent, I guess you're almost the middleman, the broker between the two parties, and that's so when people talk about defence attaché, that's a little bit of background as to what a defence attaché kind of does. You're a little in a very narrow lane in the road, rather like Ambassador Greg Moriarty is for us up now, who's an amazing ambassador. He really is just an incredibly energetic and talented young ambassador for Australia who's doing us proud up there. You're kind of like Greg's equivalent in a very narrow sense for the military relationship. I wanted to get across a couple of key messages tonight, and I'll flag them when they come up, but one of the key messages is what I call the theory of relativity, and it's important to grasp this in any discussion of Asia, and particularly Australia-Indonesia relations. And here's the theory of relativity. Asia is getting bigger and richer compared to Australia. We are getting poorer and smaller compared to Asia. We need to understand that reality as we look forward to 2030 and to 2050. It's an important reality to grasp. We are getting smaller and less powerful and less rich compared to the region that we abut. And that's an important theory of relativity. Bill Farmer, I had the privilege of listening to Bill speak at a Strategic Policy Institute gathering recently, and there's very few people as eloquent as Bill when it comes to describing Indonesia-Australia relations. He was our longest serving ambassador to Jakarta. And I'd like to kind of paraphrase Bill. And Bill said it is impossible for Indonesia and Australia to really understand each other and to get close to each other. Bill said, On the one hand, you have a country where there is widespread disillusionment with political process and democratic process. There is significant official corruption. There's an inability to pass legislation, systemic cultural issues affecting its armed forces, flagging infrastructure, an educational system in dire need of overhaul, dysfunctional relations between the central government and the provincial governments, and serious issues of human rights which must be addressed. And on the other side you have Indonesia. Bill would tell that one far better than me. But I have to say the Indonesia that I encountered was not the Indonesia that I expected to encounter. And part of that I think was because as our largest recipient of donor aid, of aid in the world, and currently I think we're looking at aid in Indonesia reaching about $1 billion a year by 2015. I guess I had a certain mindset about Indonesia before going up there. But you've all read the statistics, you've all read the Citibank forecast, the McKinsey forecast about Indonesia becoming in the world's top 10 economies in the future. It's a middle-class country. I didn't fully appreciate that. It's an incredible burgeoning middle class. The most amazing factoid for me on Indonesia is that more than 50% of the population of 250 million are in their 20s or younger. In their 20s or younger, over half that population. It's experienced sustained 6% growth year on year, end on end, even during the global financial crisis. And it really is becoming a regional economic powerhouse. Jakarta is the regional capital of Southeast Asia. Again. I guess the thing that brought it home to me though was just standing in a mall. I know some of you have been up to Indonesia recently and may recall any visits to, there's about 86 I think at last count malls in Jakarta. Now these malls make my Doncaster shopping town look like the corner store. They really do. And as you come in, it's not so much the Louis Vuitton or the Prada or the Gucci or the Emilio Zegna outlets in those malls. What really impressed me was here's the Jaguar store inside the mall. Here's the Bentley store inside the mall. We're talking about an economy and a middle class of staggering affluence, And that's something which I didn't appreciate and was something which really astonished me about the Indonesia that I met. Getting your head around Indonesia is a huge challenge. If you start on one end of the archipelago, the far western end, you'll go to the top of Sumatra, you'll meet someone in Sabah. They will be ethnically Arab, and they will have been ethnically Arab since the 1400s. You'll travel across a distance from Perth to Sydney to the far eastern end of the archipelago. You'll go to Merauke in Papua. You'll meet someone who is Melanesian and whose culture in some regards, in some parts, is not far above the Neolithic. It's an amazing, across those 340 different ethno-linguistic groups, it's hard to say, well, what is Indonesia? Or what is an Indonesian? Who is an Indonesian? It's an amazing challenge, I think, to get your head around that. It's also a country of inherent internal contradictions. Jakarta is the Twitter capital of the world. There are more Blackberries in Jakarta than any other city anywhere in the world, including China. And yet, in the same city, there is not one linear foot of sewerage. And this in a city that lies 40% below sea level. The Minangkabau people, you always think of Sumatra as being, because that's where the Arab traders first came. Sumatra is probably the most devout part of the most devout Muslims in Indonesia are in Sumatra. And the Minangkabau people are among the most devout of the most devout. And yet the Minangkabau culture is a matriarchal society. Wealth and power passes down through the mothers to daughters. So Minangkabau men traditionally have to leave the village and go in search and make their way in the world somewhere else. So here's this matriarchal society which also combines a very devout Muslim religious culture. Freedom of speech in Indonesia. Freedom of speech is amazing because you can say basically anything, the sorts of things that we cannot say in the press in Australia. You can make all sorts of allegations and accusations in the press in Indonesia. The freedoms there are amazing. On the other hand, if you do not belong to one of Indonesia's 6 recognised religions, you can't get a driver's licence. You can't get a card, an identity card. So the freedoms and the idea of infrastructure and the idea of religious contradictions, it's an amazing country. And for those of you who haven't been up there to visit, I really hope that one day you'll get up there and have a look around. It's an incredible place, which is probably part of the reason why I like it so much. But I hope that gives you a bit of a glimpse into the Indonesia that I experienced over the last 4 years. Which brings me to the next, I guess, key issue is, why is it that we seem so unable to understand each other? Why is it that we consistently misread each other's intention or misread each other's meaning in our dealings with Indonesians? To me, it's understandable in one respect. You know, we remember Gareth Evans, I think. Gareth Evans used to say there are no 2 neighbouring countries on the face of the planet more dissimilar from everything, from history to geography to culture to religion to economy than Indonesia and Australia. We are very, very different countries. But it's also kind of counterintuitive that we so often fail to make our meaning clear to each other. If you think about it, there have been hundreds of thousands of Indonesian students come through this country. This year alone, I think, as I stand here, there are 18,000. 18,000 Indonesians studying at Australian tertiary institutions. And if you look at even the ministerial lineup in the current cabinet, the Vice President, Dr. Budiano, the Foreign Minister, Marty Natalegawa, ANU School of Diplomacy, the former Trade Minister, Murray Pangestu, currently Minister for the Creative Economy, studied again in Canberra. The current Coordinating Minister for Politics, Law and Security, the former Air Chief Marshal, Joko Suyanto. Extensive training here in Western Creek in Canberra, did his flying training at East Sale. So why is it that we so often can't find a way to communicate? My theory, for what it's worth, is that we see the relationship as a series of transactions more than an overarching relationship itself. But I guess my other key message tonight to this group is the relationship is much bigger and has proven itself to be much bigger than East Timor. It's proven itself to be much bigger than 46 Papuan asylum seekers. It's proven itself to be much bigger than a cessation of the live cattle trade. When we signed the Lombok Treaty in 2006, the same year that the Papuan asylum seeker issue caused the Indonesian ambassador to Canberra to be recalled by his government. At the signing of the Lombok Treaty, Pak Hassan Wuriyuda, the Indonesian Foreign Minister, was asked, Pak, why is it that Indonesia and Australia have all these rub points? Why is the relationship quite often so fraught? And Pak Hassan thought about this and he said, well, it's something to do with proximity. He said, as an example, Indonesia has a fantastic relationship with Finland. So I guess my key message to you tonight is the relationship is and always will be bigger than boats. It's bigger than our desire to push back the boats. It's bigger than Papua and whatever happens in Papua in the future. And we have to make sure that our leaders remember that the relationship is far bigger than the series of transactions which occur within the rubric, within the framework of that relationship. So onto the defence relationship, I guess really you can't have good strategic focus, good strategic vision, unless you every so often check the rearview mirror. And I'd like to check the rearview mirror with you tonight and just take you on a bit of a roller coaster ride here over 70 years. It's kind of a sine curve that goes up and down, the defence relationship over the last 70 years. So get strapped in and hang on to your seats because it is a bit of a roller coaster. And it starts with the fall of Singapore and the Battle of Java after that. And I think people like Professor John Legge of that generation, that was the first time that Australians saw Southeast Asia, their own doorstep, in stark relief. Was when Java fell, was when people like Weary Dunlop were put in the bag in Bundoon, when we had the HMAS Perth sunk in the Sunda Strait. We started to really think about this Dutch colony that had been sitting just off our northwest coast. 1947, and not a lot of people realise that the first ever United Nations peacekeeping operation was a group of Australian soldiers going to keep the Dutch and the Indonesian forces apart in Yogyakarta. That was the first ever United Nations peacekeeping operation under Chapter 6. Was Australians into Indonesia to kind of the Linggadjati agreement, I think, was the agreement between the Dutch and the Indonesians. One of a series of agreements which were all broken, but Australian peacekeepers were the first ever United Nations peacekeepers into Indonesia, anywhere in the world. So in the 1940s, you have Indonesian nationhood, and it was a nationhood that Australia had a very large role in assisting. So the 40s, we were on a very much an upward trend. Similarly with the 1950s, and I think the thing you have to remember about this period of time is we were at war. There was a Cold War raging, and it was a war for the hearts and minds of all of the developing world. We sent our first defence attaché to Indonesia in 1954, just several years after our first ambassador took up residence in Jakarta. So we've had a defence relationship, a formal defence relationship, since 1954. And within that Cold War context, it was a very, very important relationship to Australia and to the United States. The 1960s for me is where the relationship starts to get incredibly interesting, because in 1961 we had our first, within this Cold War hearts and minds context, we had our first group of Indonesians come to Melbourne, to Queenscliff, and study, beginning in 1961, including the current First Lady's father. Sawo Edi Wibowo was among those first Indonesians to come and study in Queenscliff at our staff college. At the same time, Major Colonel Colin East was the first Australian to go and study in Bundoon in 1964, the year of living dangerously, as Sukarno called it. We had our first Australian military student in Bundoon. Now, what is interesting about this time, the fascinating thing about this, if you think about it, is that this is the era of confrontasi. This is the time when Australian and British troops are patrolling against Indonesian troops in Borneo. But we have at the same time our students studying in Indonesia, Indonesian students studying in Australian staff colleges. It's again one of those inherent contradictions that you come across in this incredible relationship. 1965 was the fall of Sukarno. General Suharto comes to the fore. And I think the thing we have to remember when we look back at 1998, and everyone says, oh, wasn't that terrible that we had General Suharto in charge for all those years, 30-something years? Wasn't that a terrible thing? Wasn't he a terrible dictator? We sometimes forget that we were amongst the first to proclaim, isn't this great? We have a strong man, it's the Cold War, he's pro-Western, and he can control Indonesia. So Suharto was good news for us in 1965. And things were going well again, the upward trend was continuing, confrontasi had brought it back down, the upward trend was continuing. Then we had the Act of Free Choice in 1969 in Papua, which is something we didn't want. The US government certainly wanted it, but Australia did not want that Act of Free Choice. We didn't want the Indonesian rule that close to Australia. The 1970s started again on an upward trend after the Act of Free Choice. 1972 we had the Defence Cooperation Program started with the gifting of some inshore patrol vessels, some aircraft. We had a material exchange with the Indonesians under the rubric of this Defence Cooperation Program. We then started sending a group of cadets. The first Australian cadets, Army cadets, went to the Indonesian Military Academy when a young cadet called Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono was at the Indonesian Military Academy in 1973. The first Australian cadet exchange began. The following year, the Indonesian cadets came to the Royal Military College Duntroon on exchange, and they also went to Jervis Bay and to Point Cook. And I'd ask you to just kind of keep that one in the back of your mind, because we're going to come back to that 1974 visit in just a minute. But of course, as Gary Neal would well recall, in 1975 it kind of all went pear-shaped again. The roller coaster went back down the hill because we had the East Timor situation, the Indonesian injection of troops and annexation of East Timor. We had the Balibo 5, I guess Balibo 6, if you include Roger East. So things were, having been on the up and up, the roller coaster was going down again. 1980s, things started out pretty good. We had our first head of Australian Defence Staff, which was a one-star officer. We only have them in Washington, in London, and now we had one in Jakarta. Keith Henry Kirkland was our first head of Australian Defence Staff in 1980. So the 80s started out with a bang because we kind of branded the Indonesian defence relationship right up there with Washington and London. Unfortunately, a very troublesome journalist called David Jenkins wrote a series of articles, in 1986 about corruption, as he well should have. Within the Suharto family, Indonesian military students were brought home. The relationship, the defence relationship, went into a deep freeze on the Indonesian side. But again, ironically and astonishingly, Australian students stayed in Indonesian staff colleges during that very difficult time after the Jenkins articles in the Sydney Morning Herald. We had a white paper in 1987 where we were talking about lodgement forces in the northwest of Australia, a totally incredible contingency, but one which we, I guess, used to justify levels of spending. Does it sound familiar? In our white paper. But the Missourian Armed Forces were the enemy that we had, and the word is taken from the Indonesian word for enemy, musuh. So it was no coincidence, I don't believe, that we used that word to base the word for enemy. So the relationship was kind of on the downward slide again. And here's the really fascinating part for me of the relationship, the year 1991. In 1991 we had Teresa Trisno, the Indonesian head of Defence Force, come out, and he was Dutchessed, and he was looked after by Peter Gratian, our own Chief of Defence Force. They came here to this city and they went to the Melbourne Cup in full tails and morning suit, top hat. And in that year there were two Bart Cummings horses. One was Let's Elope, and the second was a thing called Shiva's Revenge. Shiva is the Indian god of destruction. And actually Teresa Trisno, his money went on Shiva's Revenge. True story. And now all the conspiracy theorists believe that when that shocking, outrageous and atrocious assault on civilians at the Santa Cruz Cemetery in Dili occurred about 10 days later, in November of 1991, all the conspiracy theorists believe that Teresa Trisno that was his foreshadowing of that by putting his money on Shiva's Revenge. I don't believe a word of it, but it makes for a great story. But certainly, the interesting thing about the massacre at the Santa Cruz Cemetery is that after that time, the United States walked away from Indonesia for 15 years in the defence relationship. 15 years. And don't think the Indonesians don't remember this. But Australia didn't. In fact, not only did we not walk away from the relationship after the Santa Cruz massacre, but the following year, 1992 or 93, Neil will know, being an old SAS man himself, we started a Kopassus, a Special Forces relationship between our two Special Forces. Part of that, I think, was because we needed Indonesian support. We needed Ali Alatas and other support to pull off what Gareth Evans was trying to pull off in Cambodia. In fact, we served, Indonesian and Australian troops served together in Cambodia in that United Nations Transitional Authority operation, Indonesian Battalion under command of General John Sanderson. So Australia, we can't walk away from our relationship with Indonesia. The United States can. And I think this is a wonderful case study in Australian realpolitik, in the fact that we, not only did we not walk away from Indonesia, but the 1990s saw an exponential rise in our defence cooperation together, to the extent that on Kangaroo exercise in 1995 in Northern Australia, we had Indonesian troops jumping out the back of Australian C-130 Hercules. So once again, the relationship was on the up and up right throughout the 1990s. The high water mark was the forum between senior Australian officers and senior Indonesian officers at, I think, the Shangri-La Hotel, Neil, in Jakarta. in early 1999. So by 1999 we were going great guns. And then East Timor. And we are just now starting to recover from the days of Australia, I guess, being seen by the Indonesians as almost the unindicted co-conspirator into the carving off of the 33rd province of East Timor from Indonesia. We're just coming out of that period now. And certainly a few things helped that. Between the bombings in Bali in 2002, our own embassy bombing in 2004, later that year, of course, the Aceh tsunami, which saw Australian troops on the ground helping with disaster relief. Kind of disasters and bombings brought us back into a sphere together, and we signed the Lombok Treaty in 2006. And I think there was again an acknowledgement that we can't just walk away from each other. We just can't do it, our two countries. So really, I guess that is an up and down potted history of the relationship over the last 70 years. And I hope that it gives you the sense that it does oscillate. It is like a sine curve. And if you extrapolate that, I guess you'll come to the inevitable conclusion that there will be something on the horizon which will drag it down again. Who knows what that might be? I certainly can't predict it. And that makes it even more important, I think, today when the relationship is really on the up and up, that we invest, as Gareth Evans called it, more ballast into that relationship. And we certainly are doing that. We are now at current levels of defence engagement between the two countries, which are as high as any we've had in the history of the relationship. The white paper, the recent white paper released in earlier this year, I think if you read that, you see that the strategic partnership, as it's called, between Australia and Indonesia is really put up in lights. It's the most talked about relationship in that part of the white paper after our alliance with the United States. And I do think that's not accidental. I think people are finally really getting the idea that we do need, in this Asian century, to have a robust and a durable defence relationship with our large neighbour. So what are the sort of things that are changing? Look, really, just about everything. But there are some really interesting changes which enable this higher plane in our defence relationship. First of all, I think is a democratising Indonesia. This means that the military's role is, although the military is still largely focused on internal security, the military's role is steadily shifting to become more like the role that we have in Australia. We also have a great political will. General David Hurley and all of the service chiefs and all of the seniors in Canberra have an incredible will to engage with Indonesia. And this is, again, a key enabler of the relationship at other levels. We also have a situation where we are disengaging and drawing down from places like East Timor, places like the Solomons and Afghanistan, and this gives us more resources to use to engage with Indonesia and the region. So there's that kind of phenomenon as well. There's also, I guess, the globalisation and the social media phenomenon. And let me tell you a little story about that, and it involves the Indonesia-Australia Defence Alumni Association, and it's a fascinating story. I spoke earlier about the 1974 class that came from Indonesian Military Academy to Duntroon. A very young cadet at Duntroon called David Hurley, now our Chief of Defence Force, was one of the hosting officers of that little group of Indonesian cadets. That was in 1974. David Hurley took about 34 years to come back to Indonesia. He'd never been to Indonesia in his life until 2009. When he went there, amazingly enough, he met up with one of the cadets, Major General Bambang Heru Sukmadi, that he had hosted 30-some years before in 1974. He asked himself, why is it that I have not been able, in an era of the internet, an era of social media, why haven't I been able to keep contact with Bambang Heru? Why have we not been able to kind of, share not only our career milestones together, but also family and children and grandchildren and things like that? So he directed the defence staff at Post to create for him a Defence Alumni Association which would enable the younger generation, because let's face it, the majors and the colonels are the ones who really do use the social media and the internet and Twitter and all these things, to use social media, to use the internet to keep in touch. So for the Indonesians training and travelling to Australia, to go back to Indonesia, but still to keep in touch with the people that the relationships that they've formed, and vice versa for the Australians that train in Indonesia every year. It's currently got a membership of over 1,000 people. It's been going, I think General Hurley launched the Alumni Association in March 2011. So it's been going on for a little over 2 years, I guess. But it's a powerful tool for us to get our message out, for the Indonesians to get their message into that same. There are chat rooms, there are sort of classes have their own internal sites on the website. So it really is quite an amazing enabler. So what of the future? And I know I'd really like to leave time for some questions. The two things which I think we need to keep in mind when we talk about the future of the defence relationship are, one, the US rebalancing to Asia and the rise of China. We've never seen the sort of tectonic shifts that are going on geostrategically before, I don't think, possibly in history, as the rise of China and the US-China rivalry within that context. So our relationship with Indonesia has to take cognizance of that. I think we also need to take cognizance of the fact that Indonesia is changing. How Indonesia treats us today may not be the same way that it treats us in 20 or 30 years' time. So we need to kind of keep a weather eye, I believe, on how that relation, the dynamic between the two countries is going. I guess T&I reform is also, is T&I reform perfect? No, it's not. Is it happening? Yes, it is. Is that a good thing? Yes, it is. And I think the more that T&I reforms, the more that its leadership are more cosmopolitan, worldly wise people, and I do think this is happening. If you look at the sheer trend line, the classes that graduated from the Indonesian Academy post-1983 will have spent more of their military career under a democratic Indonesia than they did under the new order of Suharto. And this will exponentially increase in the next 5 to 10 years. So I do think it'll be easier for the leadership of the two countries to speak a similar kind of professional language, and I do think we won't have to absorb, I don't think we'll have to absorb the sort of risks we've had to absorb in the past in engaging with some senior Indonesian officers who weren't perhaps as worldly wise or as enlightened as this current crop seems to be. And I do think that Indonesia's forced modernisation, one result of their incredible economic growth, is that Indonesia is modernising. They're buying tanks from Germany, they're buying submarines from South Korea, they're buying fighter aircraft from the United States, they're buying patrol boats from the Netherlands. They are modernising. But the bit that I think is the opportunity bit for Australia is not in selling pieces of kit. I think our opportunity is in helping them with the cultural aspects of modernisation, or the so-called process of professionalisation. Now, our high stock in our trade with Indonesia has always been our brainware and our smart power. And Indonesians, I think, are great admirers of our education system and of the potential opportunities to conduct education and professional military education between the two countries. And I think that's something that we can do a lot more of in the future. Look, I'd leave you with one last thought before opening the floor to questions, and that is, why is the defence relationship between our two countries important? And I've kind of touched on various aspects of that, but when it's all boiled down, in the final analysis, I think we only want two things. As a nation, as a neighbour, as a country next door to Indonesia, I think we only really want two things. One is that Indonesia remains stable, and the other is that Indonesia remains secular. Because there was a time when it was almost the Islamic Republic of Indonesia, back in the 1940s. It was a close-run thing. I think we want the Republic of Indonesia, not the Islamic Republic of Indonesia, as our neighbour. So stable and secular are the two things I think in our vital national interest about Indonesia. Now, the one organ of government, the one unit in that country which has the best chance of making sure that those two characteristics of Indonesia continue is the Tentara Nasional Indonesia. I see them for all their warts, but I think in terms of pure hard-nosed international diplomacy, we need to make sure that we have a good relationship with TNI. It's fantastic right now. It may not be fantastic into the future, so let's invest more in that relationship as we move forward. Les, thank you very much for allowing me to